Hi, I'm Frank Spear, and I want to welcome you to this segment on occlusion. You know, through the years I've been involved in dental education, one thing I've been asked to record for years is a portion on doing bite records in restorative dental cases, when we're prepping teeth, for example. And somehow through all the years that I've done DVDs and videos, it's one segment I've actually never done before. So for all those of you that requested it, these two parts on bite records and restorative dentistry should finally satisfy that desire. So what we're going to do is basically walk through the concepts of utilization of bite records when we're prepping teeth. And we're going to talk about like 1, 2, or 3 posterior teeth. We'll talk about all the posterior teeth in an arch. We'll talk about if we did all the anterior teeth with full crowns and left some posterior teeth, bite records in that case. We'll talk about if we do full arch, and in another segment talk about if we do a full mouth. So we'll cover kind of all the possibilities surrounding bite records involved in restorative dentistry. And where I'd like to start is I'd like to start out by just talking about some simple principles that I believe we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about bite registration in restorative dentistry. And the principles are not at all complicated, but you do need to follow them if you want to get a predictable result. So the first obvious principle would be we want to make sure we use materials that are non-compressible. And I happen to favor silicone, but I will tell you I also use wax. And as we go through some of these examples, I'll describe why I use silicone in some examples and why I might consider wax in other areas. The next thing you have to remember is your technician. Your technician has to be able to mount these models and not have them rocking. So typically I want to spread an antero-posterior spread of at least 3 to 4 teeth, so that when you go to mount the models, there's not the risk of that model tipping forward or backward. So we want a very firm, non-compressible material, and we want at least 3 to 4 teeth ideally on each side to keep that model from rocking. Next thing is we want to make sure that the bite record allows the model to sit completely into the record. And this is actually a really big issue. When we do impressions, whether they're alginate or silicone, and we pour stone into the model, the stone expands slightly. In addition, our models are never quite as detailed and accurate as the mouth is when we're talking about like an opposing model. But when we do things like silicone bite registration paste picks up every bit of detail perfectly accurately in our teeth. And so the fact of the matter is, when people take a silicone bite record and they try and fit models in it and they say, oh, the silicone's spongy. No, it's not the silicone that's spongy. The model's not fitting in into the bite record completely. And so all of our silicone records have to be trimmed. We have to trim off the walls. We have to take away the detail of the little grooves and marginal ridges so that the model can seat completely into that record. And as soon as you do that, all of a sudden the models don't bounce at all. So the silicone's not the problem. It's the fit of the model into the silicone. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, when I was a grad student in late 70s, we used to use zinc oxide eugenol as a bite registration paste. Phenomenally accurate. Very, very hard, very, very accurate. We had exactly the same problem, that in fact can't get the model to fit down in it unless you trim it and remove all of that extra detail. One of our grad students in the 70s at Washington, a fellow named Terry Morgan, who was a phenomenal restorative dentist, prosthodontist, his master's thesis was in fact on the accuracy of bite recording materials. And what he found was that zinc oxide eugenol was the most accurate, but if you didn't trim it, it was the least accurate because your models didn't fit in it. Wax, on the other hand, was a less accurate material, but the models fit in it all the time. And so I do use wax. I'm going to give you some examples throughout these sections on bite registration of when I use wax. One of the beautiful things about wax is you don't have to trim it to get your model to seat in it, because it doesn't record all of that extraneous detail, all that fine detail that silicone does, or some of the bisacryl types of recording materials. So keep in mind, this is a very big issue as we're going through this segment, is making sure the model actually sits in the record completely. And then finally, anytime I'm doing restorative dentistry, I actually try and make sure that my bite record is made at the same vertical dimension I want the final restorations made. I would prefer the laboratory not be opening and closing the articulator. Now, if they happen to do it a small amount, not a big deal. But realize, since we're doing ear bows for our face bow, that we're not doing a mounting that's truly on the arc of rotation of the patient, and any vertical changes introduces an error into the system. So I pretty much automatically try and make sure that my bite records are always done at the same vertical dimension that the lab's going to build the case at. So those would be the fundamental principles that would go into designing how I'm going to do bite records on prepared teeth. Now, we have to realize there's fundamentally two different types of bite records when we talk about maxillomandibular relationships. There are centric relation bite records that we make with the condyle seated, and there are bite records done in maximum intercuspation. So we need to be clear on when we use centric relation records and when we use bite records that are done in maximum intercuspation, because we don't want to provide records to the laboratory that in fact the laboratory can't utilize. So when do we use a centric relation record as a bite record when we're doing restorative dentistry? Essentially any time we are restoring the entire occlusion. And so, for example, a full arch like this, which is integrated with implants and natural teeth, but I'm restoring the entire arch, that bite record is going to be made in centric relation because there is no existing occlusion. We've removed that patient's occlusion. Their old maximum intercuspal position doesn't exist anymore. So we're going to do a centric relation record, and the lab is going to fabricate the entire reconstruction in centric relation. For me, the only exception to that would be if, in fact, the patient had a jaw joint problem where I couldn't use centric relation. Then I would have to do something else. But if I'm restoring all of the occlusion in a patient, I will use a centric relation bite record when I do the record for the reconstruction. The other time I use a centric relation bite record is when I'm mounting models to do my functional analysis. So anytime I'm doing all of my initial workup on a patient, I want to use a centric relation record so I can evaluate their occlusion in all positions of the mandible. If I just hand articulate models, I don't know what actually happens in the patient when their condyles go into a more retruded position. But by mounting the models with the condyles in that seated position, now I can see everything that happens and I can develop the patient's new occlusion in a seated condylar position. So, when would we use a maximum intercuspal position record, or if you will, when would we not use a centric relation record? When we're not restoring the whole occlusion. So if I'm doing 2 teeth, 3 teeth, 4 teeth, 5 teeth, whatever, I'm going to use a bite record done in maximum intercuspal position because we're not changing the patient's entire occlusion. Now, if you happen to have a patient who you have equilibrated into centric relation, then in reality, your maximum intercuspal position is in centric relation. But typically, I don't think about calling that a CR record. I think about calling that anytime we're doing limited number of teeth, for me, that's a bite record done by asking the patient to bite into their maximum position of intercuspation. So fundamental concept, CR records when you're restoring all of the occlusion, bite records done by asking the patient to close into intercuspal position when you're not restoring all of their occlusion. Now, to use the patient's maximum intercuspal position, you have to leave enough teeth that they know where to bite. So if you prepped all this patient's back teeth maximum intercuspal position doesn't exist anymore, and we would convert to a centric relation bite record. But if you're only prepping 3 of this patient's back teeth, now they still have enough teeth left to bite into. So the big issue is anytime you're leaving enough posterior teeth that the patient still knows where to close, you can use a simple record and ask the patient to bite into it. You don't need to think about actually deprogramming or finding centric relation. Now, what I want to do is show you some refinements about bite records made in maximum intercuspation. So we're just going to take this very simple case. It's 2 implant restorations. So the patient definitely knows where to bite. They still have all of their remaining teeth to bite into. So the first question would be, do you even need a bite record? You're doing 2 restorations, all those other teeth are there. My advice would be yes, and here's why. Oftentimes, if you try and hand articulate models, you'll notice you don't know how they fit. So you'll sit there with these models and you're trying to figure out how to get them together and you don't know how to get them together. So for me, the reason to use a bite record, even on cases where I'm only doing 2 teeth, is so the bite record helps orient the lab as to how to orient the occlusion. Because the bite record on those 2 teeth is going to orient the rest of the occlusion. Now, why not make it simple and just take silicone and squirt it all the way around the arch and let the patient bite into it? Because you'll never get the models seated in it. If we inject silicone on unprepared teeth and we ask the patient to bite into it, when your lab takes that record and tries to put those models in there, it's going to bounce. The models are going to bounce. And there's no way to trim that silicone because it's so thin and fragile. And so when we do bite records in maximum intercuspation, one of my first rules is the bite record only covers the prepared teeth, not the adjacent teeth. So here's the bite record that was made for mounting this case. You will notice it actually goes on to each adjacent tooth. It's not just on those 2 crowns. It actually goes on to the second molar and it goes on forward up to the cuspid. If your lab mounts these models with this bite record, you're going to get high restorations because the models aren't going to sit all the way into the bite record. And so rule number 1 for me when you do maximum intercuspal position records is trim the bite record so none of it covers the adjacent teeth. So right now, this is what it would look like if you just mounted the models with the record the way it is. Guaranteed your 2 crowns will be high because those models aren't fitting all the way into it. And now your stone hardens that you're mounting with, your lab builds the 2 restorations into occlusion, you get high restorations. So we'll take a scalpel, lab knife, and we'll cut off the adjacent part of the silicone that extends onto the second molar, extends onto the cuspid. Okay? So now we only have the bite registration on the teeth we're working on the teeth that are prepared. That means this silicone has some thickness. Now we can do step number 2. Once we've trimmed it off of the adjacent teeth, now we can trim the record so our indentations are only about 1 millimeter deep. So on these 2 preps, in this case implant abutments, we want to only leave about 1 millimeter depth of indentation so our model fits all the way down into it. If you leave those things 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters deep, your model's never going to sit into it all the way. On the opposite side where the opposing teeth are, we want to take an acrylic burr and remove the marginal ridge detail, any fine detail in the occlusal surfaces, anatomy, so we just see cusp tips. And it got 1 millimeter deep cusp tips. And the check is very easy. The check is put the model into the silicone. Is there any bounce? If there's any bounce, you haven't trimmed it enough. So it's a maximum intercuspal position record. It's done first by cutting off the adjacent teeth, second by trimming the record itself so it's not so deep. Now you can mount the model. Now what's next? What's next is to make sure before you build the crowns that there is occlusal contact on that second molar and on that cuspid. Because most likely in the mouth, there's definitely occlusal contacts on that second molar and on that cuspid. So your lab trims these records and they mount the models And now they take articulating ribbon and they tap the articulator and they look to see, is there occlusal contact on that second molar? Is there occlusal contact on that canine? If there's no occlusal contact, no marks on the second molar or the canine, you equilibrate the mounting by adjusting the other teeth in the model until you get the second molar in contact and you get the cuspid in contact. So we want to equilibrate this mounting until we get a definite occlusal contact on that second molar and a definite occlusal contact on that cuspid. So we first trimmed the record, then we thinned out the record, and now we've equilibrated the models. If you now build these two crowns, high likelihood they are not going to need almost any adjustment whatsoever when you get them back to the mouth, because the lab has taken up for the errors in the process that come from using silicone. Because when we use silicone, we're simply too accurate, and we can't trim it if it's on the adjacent teeth. So we have to go through and take care of all of that and then finally get those contacts on that second molar and that cuspid. Now the lab can build the crowns. Really little chance that you're going to have much occlusal adjustment, unless you happen to make temporaries that were out of occlusion. If you made temporaries that were out of occlusion, the teeth could erupt, or in this case, these are implants, so the opposing teeth could erupt. So the other big deal with limited numbers of teeth is to be sure that your temporaries, in fact, are in occlusion. Because if they're not in occlusion, you leave the opportunity for eruption to occur. Okay? So that is intercuspal position records. They seem so simple, and yet if you don't follow all these extra little steps, you end up with high crowns all the time. Now, let's take that same concept. We're still going to do limited numbers of teeth, but let's compare bite records if we're doing full coverage posterior restorations to partial coverage posterior restorations, because there is a difference. And so in this particular mouth, we're going to do one quadrant in the posterior is going to end up with full coverage, or at least occlusal coverage. There's going to be some onlays and a full crown, whereas the other side is going to be some partial coverage. There's going to be some inlays and one full crown. So let's take this upper left, and the second premolar and the first molar and the second molar are going to get treated with full occlusal coverage. The first bicuspid is actually going to be done with an inlay. So if I now inject silicone and ask this patient to bite, the problem I'm going to have is the silicone's nice and thick over the second molar, the first molar, and the second bi. But on that first premolar, where there's unprepared tooth structure, the silicone's very thin. And I can't trim that silicone. I can't thin it out and trim it so the model will seat in it. So what do I have to do in this case? I have to take a blade and cut off the silicone record, get rid of the first bi part of it, so my silicone only covers the second premolar, the first molar, and the second molar. Now I can take my burrs and blades and I can thin out the silicone, get it to a millimeter depth of indentation, remove the marginal ridges in the anatomy and the opposing teeth. And now when I go to mount this model, it won't bounce. It'll sit nice and stable. But if I would have left that silicone onto that first premolar, which is intracoronal, I would never get rid of that bounce because I can't thin it out. I can't clean up the silicone. So the opposite side you're going to see in a minute, in fact, is intracoronal restorations. And what can you do with intracoronal restorations for a bite record? You can use wax, because you don't have to trim wax. And so your other alternative, if you wanted to have a record that captured the first bi, is to use wax, nice firm wax. And through the years, I've used everything from hard base plate wax to different waxes from people like Delar, and Great Lakes makes a very nice blue wax that we use right now. It holds the temper well. The patient bites all the way into intercuspal position, and you don't have to worry about trying to take a blade and trimming it to get your model to seat. What's the downside of wax? The downside of wax is it distorts when you ship it. So the risk of using wax is it can end up very distorted if you don't maintain it in a certain temperature and in a certain type of environment. So that's the risk of using wax. So for this case, what I would do, what I did do, squirted silicone on the whole quadrant, had the patient bite, and then the lab simply cut off the first bicuspid and they trimmed the silicone bite record over the second molar, first molar, and second bi. And the rest of this case is easy. Here's the matrix that's used to make the temporary. There's the temporary material in place, temporary is adjusted, and then finally the case is tried in seated, the bite's being adjusted. Very straightforward. And you should have, in a case like this, really minimal bite adjustment if your lab goes through all those techniques of trimming the silicone, getting it off the first bi, trimming it so there's no bounce in the models whatsoever. There shouldn't be a whole lot of bite adjustment in a case like this. Now, if we go to the opposite side, in the opposite side, I'm going to do only one full occlusal coverage restoration. Everything else is going to be intracoronal. So there's our left side that you just saw. Here's our right side with all the amalgams in place. And here's the preps. The first molar is full occlusal coverage, but the other two are partial occlusal coverage. You have a couple of choices how to make the bite record. If you use silicone and squirt silicone in here, there's no way you're going to get the model to fit into the record on the second molar or on the second premolar because they're both partial coverage. There's still cusp there, and you can't trim the silicone in those areas. So if I used silicone, what I would do is I would cut off the second molar and cut off the second bi and just leave silicone over the first molar. And that will be enough to help your lab know how to orient those models. Once they get the record trimmed, so there's no bounce in the model, now they mount it, and then what do? They then equilibrate until you see occlusal contact on the cusp, the palatal cusp of that second molar, and some portion of that second premolar, unless it's obvious that those teeth don't touch in the mouth. But you would treat these three teeth very much like you would treat doing 2 or 3 teeth with adjacent unrestored teeth, is you would make sure there's occlusal contacts on that second molar cusp and second bi, unless, as I said, it's obvious that there's no contact on the opposing tooth when you really look at them, when you hand articulate them. Your alternative to all of that is to use wax. And if you use wax, you could have gone ahead and put wax on the second bi, the first molar, and the second molar, let the patient close all the way through the wax, so that palatal cusp on the second molar would be going all the way through the wax. And I happen to know that that palatal cusp does have occlusion on the tip of it, so I would know to tell my lab, you know what, after you mount these, check the mounting. If there's no occlusion on the palatal cusp of the second molar, equilibrate the mounting until you pick up that occlusal mark on that second molar. So silicone or wax works. You just have to understand the limitations of each. The limitation of wax is the risk of distortion. The limitation of silicone is you got to have it thick enough so that you can actually trim it to get your models fitting down into it. And then here's the temporaries in this patient. And again, here's the try-in of the final restorations and bite adjustment. And again, there should be very little bite adjustment on this case. We know right now the occlusion's only on the restoration, so I know we have to adjust it because that palatal cusp should come into occlusion. And here it is after the case is seated and the occlusion's been adjusted to get back to the same occlusal contacts, intercuspal position contacts that the patient had before. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of some of the most common dentistry that we see done. Limited numbers of teeth, using the patient's existing intercuspal position, and really it's just a matter of paying attention to how are you prepping the teeth. If you're doing full occlusal coverage, squirt silicone across the top, but make sure your lab cuts it off when it gets to the natural unprepared teeth and trims it. Now, let's go a little bit farther. Let's prep all the back teeth in an arch. So we're going to leave the natural anterior teeth, and we're going to prep all the posterior teeth. Now, in a patient like this, it's not uncommon to see in one of the magazines we get in the mail where somebody shows you how to prep all of these teeth, and they do it by prepping 2 teeth, making a bite registration by having the patient bite, making temporaries on those 2 teeth, then go prep the adjacent 2 teeth, and then add to the bite registration there, and then go to the other side. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to maintain the patient's existing occlusion, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. If you have a patient whose jaw joints are asymptomatic, they can go forward and back and squeeze on a leaf gauge comfortably, which tells us we can seat the condyle comfortably. And you are prepping all of the back teeth. Using a centric relation record is so much easier and so much more predictable for the patient. When you try and hold their mandible forward and prep and remove all of their occlusion, there's all kinds of things that can happen as to whether you can truly keep them in that position or not. But if you look at this patient, he's breaking posterior teeth, he's wearing holes in posterior teeth, and he has very little wear on his anteeth. This patient happens to have a big shift. When his condyles seat, he has an anterior open bite that's pretty significant. Well, if I want to protect his new posterior restorations, I want his anterior teeth to touch with the condyle seated, so that as he moves, the anterior teeth will disclude the posterior teeth. And so anytime I'm doing all of the posterior teeth, as long as I know that that patient's joints can be seated comfortably, and a quick check, put in a leaf gauge, forward, back, squeeze. You're comfortable, hold it for 30 seconds, you're still comfortable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and prepare all those posterior teeth at once. And so I'll start on the upper left. Here's the upper left teeth prepared. Then we'll move over and we'll now do the upper right. And so now we've got the upper right teeth prepared. So now all the posterior teeth are prepared. We have eliminated his intercuspal position. His intercuspal position doesn't exist anymore. And now we're going to make our bite record. But before we do that, we are going to equilibrate the anterior teeth in CR. And that probably sounds a little bit strange, because it's like, well, what are you going to equilibrate on the front teeth? Well, what I would do is I would put in a leaf gauge. I'd have him go forward, back, squeeze. I already know he's going to be comfortable. And I would take one leaf out. Have him go forward, back, squeeze. Take one leaf out. What am I looking for? I'm starting to take one leaf at a time out. I want to see if that bicuspid and canine on the right side touch the opposing teeth at the same time as the cuspid on the left side does. Because if he hits one side before the other and I don't adjust it, what it means is he's going to actually have a lateral shift in his occlusion. And so I'll take the leaf gauge, forward, back. Finally, he'll hit either this side, or potentially both at the same time. If he hits the left side first, the left cuspid first, and the right's not touching, I'll adjust the lingual of the left cuspid, take another leaf out, forward, back, squeeze, adjust the left cuspid. What am I looking for? I want the two canines touching at the same time with the condyle seated. Now, once I get that, I'll now take the leaf gauge out completely, and it may actually be down to like one leaf anyway. I'll ask him to bite, and I'll go back and I'll recheck my occlusal clearance on all the posteriors to make sure I have 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters of clearance. So I've prepared all the posterior teeth, and I've done little touch-up equilibration on the anteriors, which in his case literally took almost nothing because he had virtually no lateral shift to begin with. And I've checked my clearance. Now, how am I going to make my bite record? Well, you'll see things like somebody will go ahead and make the temporaries first, adjust the temporaries, now take the temporaries out on one side, put bite registration paste in, ask the patient to close, then take the temporary out on the other side. You don't need to do all of that. Once you have all the posterior teeth prepared and you've done this minor equilibration in the front, you can use the anterior teeth basically as an anterior stop and use the joints as the posterior stop. So how did I make his bite record? I squirted silicone on the posterior teeth. I asked him to close on his back teeth and squeeze. What set the vertical dimension? His anterior teeth. His anterior teeth are acting as a deprogrammer. So we've got a tripod. We've got the anterior teeth in the front of the tripod and the jaw joints in the back of the tripod. Ultra simple way to do it. When you have the opportunity, if you're preparing somebody's teeth in the posterior, all the teeth in the posterior, This is the easiest bite record there is. Instead of all of this horsing around trying to keep this, prepare the teeth, equilibrate the anterior teeth if necessary, have the patient close on their back teeth, squirt in your silicone, you're done. Okay? So we've looked at maximum intercuspal position records. This is in fact a centric relation record, but it's a centric relation record because we are restoring his entire occlusion. Okay? All of his posterior occlusions being restored, and we tweaked his anterior teeth slightly. So we've gone through simple stuff. This is a bit more complex. The last one we're going to look at in this segment seemingly wouldn't be complex. We're going to do full crowns on the anterior teeth, but we're going to leave some posterior teeth. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to a case that seemingly isn't a lot more difficult, but in fact, it's a case that actually a lot of dentists have problems with. And it's when you're doing full coverage restorations on the anterior teeth, but you're leaving some posterior teeth. So in this case, we're going to be restoring from second premolar to second premolar, but we're going to be leaving the molars. Now, it seems like it would be simple as could be. You prepare the anterior teeth, you make your final impression, and to get your bite record, you've got molars back there, so you squirt your silicone on the anteriors and you ask the patient to bite. If you do that, there's this really high likelihood that you're going to get a phone call from your lab. And your lab's going to say, I mounted this case that you sent over, and you don't have any room on the lingual of your anterior teeth. There's no clearance. And you're going to be, well, sure there's clearance. I know there's clearance because I have provisionals in there and they're plenty thick. But they're going to say, no, you want me to send over the mounting. And sure enough, they'll send you back the mounting. And when you look at it, the lower incisors are occluding against the lingual of your preps. So let's watch how that could happen. And this is a patient I'm going to skip a whole lot of steps because she went through some orthodontics and some periodontal surgery because obviously the teeth are very short and very square. And so skipping all of those steps, here she is in provisional restorations, following all the preparatory things, and it's now time for the final impression and bite records. And so here's the change aesthetically between where she started and her provisionals. And I've now taken the provisionals off. The molars are still in contact on that right side in the back. And I've got my retraction cord in place, and I'm going to make my final impression. So all of that's very straightforward. And I know I've got plenty of clearance because, in fact, my provisional is at least 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters thick on the lingual. The whole case was done after all the ortho and surgery. We had a diagnostic wax-up done, and I used preparation guides, so I know there's plenty of space. So that's not an issue. Now, here's the problem. Anytime you prep full crowns on anterior teeth, so you've now prepared the lingual of the anterior teeth, when you go to make your bite registration, what most people do is they squirt in their silicone and they instruct the patient to bite. And what's the patient do? When we say bite to a patient, they typically bite forward so they hit their front teeth. If I say bite to this patient, guess what she does? Look at her left central. She bites and slides her jaw forward until her lower left central is touching the lingual of my prep. If I made a bite record this way and sent it to the lab will call me and say there's no space, there's no clearance. And so my rule for you, anytime you are doing full crowns on anterior teeth, if you're doing veneers, it's a non-issue because you didn't prep the lingual. But if you're doing full crowns on all the anterior teeth, you have to create a stop so that this patient doesn't slide forward. Your alternative is to use bilateral manipulation. If you use bilateral manipulation and you keep the condyle seated, then the patient can't slide forward. But typically the easy tool is to use some kind of an anterior stop. Now, there's at least 3 options I'll show you that you can use easily as an anterior stop. And just to show you that they're all three going to give you the exact same thing, what I did is I had this patient bite down in her provisionals, and I took a caliper and I adjusted the caliper so it went from the gingival margin of the left central to the gingival margin of the lower left central. So that's basically just a record of this patient's vertical dimension of her provisional occlusion. So what's one alternative? Well, one alternative would be to section her temporaries and put the two central temporaries in. If you put the two central temporaries in, assuming that they are in occlusion when she bites, and you now squirt silicone in on each side of them and ask her to bite, those two central temporaries will keep her from sliding forward. So that's one option, but I hate cutting up my temporaries because I usually leave my temps one piece from canine to canine. Second option, make a little composite lucia jig, not a pre-made one, but a little one out of composite. So what do you see in this photograph? Composite that I molded and put over the two central incisor preps, cured it with a light, and then took a burr and adjusted it. I had her slide forward and back. Squeeze. You touching this molar yet? Nope. Slide forward, back, squeeze. You touching the molar yet? Nope. Adjust the lucia jig a little bit more. Forward, back, squeeze. Touching the molars yet? Nope. Adjust the lucia jig a little bit more. When you finally adjust the lucia jig, so she goes forward, back, and when she squeezes, she's hitting these molars and she's hitting the lucia jig. If you now put the calipers up to the gingiva, you're in exactly the same place you were beforehand. How do you make the bite record? Squirt in your silicone, ask her to close on her back teeth and squeeze. Simple as can be. Now she can't slide forward. And you'll notice the language I use. I always use the language close on your back teeth and squeeze instead of bite. Bite is a dangerous word when you're doing bite records because people do typically bite forward. So I'm very careful about using the language close on your back teeth and squeeze or bite on your back teeth and squeeze. Never just bite. But you could cut up the temps and do the same thing. You can make the composite lucia jig. What's the easiest? The easiest, hands down, is a leaf gauge. Just an adjustable feeler gauge. You put in too many leaves. They go forward, back, they're not touching the molars. Take one leaf away. Forward, back, they're not touching the molars. Take another leaf away. Forward, back, they're not touching the molars. Take another leaf away. Forward, back, boom, they're hitting the molars. Squirt in your silicone, have them close on their back teeth and squeeze. You get the exact same bite record. So the key in this case is you're going to have a bite record that goes from lateral back to second bi on each side. The two centrals are not going to have any bite record over the top of it because you need a stop there to keep them from sliding forward. Even though she's got molars that are still in occlusion, she doesn't have any lingual stops in the front, she'll slide forward on you. So if you look at what goes to the laboratory, there's a face bow, there's a model of her provisional, there's an opposing model, there's our final impression, and then there's our two bite records. And those two bite records basically cover from lateral back to second bi on each side. So they get 3 to 4 teeth in each record. It's at the same vertical dimension that you want the lab to actually build the case. Very easy to mount. And here's what the case looked like. And now your lab isn't going to call you. They're not going to call and say, hey, you got no clearance on the lingual of your teeth. Because we made sure there was actually a stop there that prevented the mandible from slipping forward. And again, here's where she ended up. So I hope this section of centric relation records, intercuspal position records, silicone versus wax, has all made sense to you. I hope it clarifies perhaps why you've had some problems with some of the cases you've done. In our other section, what we're going to do is go into more complex cases. So we'll prep a full arch and we'll prep a full mouth. And we'll talk about the records that are needed in those cases. So I've enjoyed sharing all this with you, and I look forward to seeing you soon.